After I got out of prison, my buddy and I opened an auto shop together. He put up the cash, I provided the expertise, and we agreed on a 7,030 split. Relying on my custom tuning skills, we took the local trust fundraising scene by storm in our very first year, clearing $8 million in net profit. But when I went to collect my cut at the end of the year, he handed me a check for only 10 grand. I sat across from Derek in that oversized leather chair he'd bought with money my hands had earned, listening to him explain, syllable by patronizing syllable, why the man who'd built his business from a bankruptcy filing into a Ferrari-lined courtyard deserved to be treated like an entry-level oil change tech. He told me it was his relationships that mattered, his golf games and his craft beer nights with trust fund kids who liked being around him, and that I was just the grease-covered guy in the back who happened to be convenient. I let him finish. I let every insult land without flinching, because I had already spent 3 years in a cell, learning the one lesson prison teaches better than any classroom ever could. Never let a man see the moment you decide he's finished. I told him evenly that I understood, that I'd think about it, and I walked out of that office with a debit card holding $10,000 and a mind already assembling the architecture of his ruin. I didn't quit that day like some men might have in the heat of humiliation. I stayed. I stayed for 3 more weeks, smiling at customers, tuning engines with the same precision I'd once used to calculate re-entry trajectories, and quietly, patiently, I began pulling threads Derek had never imagined anyone would think to pull. The first thread was the client list. Every one of those trust fund kids Derek loved to boast about, the ones he claimed came for his charm and his golf handicap, had, over the past year, been handed my personal cell number for emergency tuning consults, because Derek hated being bothered after 6 p.m. and I'd never minded. I had built relationships with every single one of them directly, diagnosing their cars over the phone at midnight, meeting them at track days on weekends, remembering their kids' names and their divorce settlements, and which one of them was quietly buying his mistress a Huracan behind his wife's back. Derek thought those relationships belonged to him because he was the one shaking hands in the lobby. He never understood that a relationship built on a handshake evaporates the moment the hand stops being useful, while a relationship built on trust, on being the man who fixes what's actually broken at 2 in the morning, calcifies into something closer to loyalty. I had that loyalty. Derek had a Rolodex. The second thread was quieter and considerably more dangerous, because it involved Richard Herman, and Richard Herman was not a man who forgot being turned down. When he called me offering $500,000 a year and 50% of shop profits, I declined without hesitation, out of a loyalty to Derek that I now understood had been staggeringly one-sided. I called Herman back that same night, and I told him I'd changed my mind, but not in the way he expected. I didn't want his job. I wanted his patience. I asked him for 30 days before I gave him an answer, and I asked him one specific favor in return. Quietly, through his considerable industry contacts, find out exactly who was supplying Derek's shop with the black market parts Derek had spent a year publicly denying he ever touched. Herman, delighted at the mere possibility of gutting a competitor, agreed before I'd finished the sentence. What came back within 2 weeks detonated something in my chest that felt less like anger and more like clarity. Derek had never stopped the part theft ring he claimed to have hired me to fix. He had simply rerouted it, personally, quietly skimming inventory himself and reselling stolen components through a chop shop 2 counties over. A business relationship that predated my arrival and had apparently never ended, only gone underground the moment he needed a clean-cut aerospace engineer to be the face of legitimacy out front. Every dollar of that $8 million in profit Derek had bragged about wasn't just built on my tuning skill. A significant slice of it was built on stolen parts laundered through our books, parts that, if traced back through a state investigation, would implicate the shop's licensed owner criminally, not its unlicensed ex-con technician who'd simply been calculating torque curves in the back bay. Derek had spent a year explaining to me that anyone could turn a wrench, that I wasn't special, that his relationships were the real asset. He never once considered that the real asset walking around his shop was the only person who understood, mathematically, precisely how to make an entire business model collapse without leaving a single fingerprint on the wreckage. I didn't go to the police. That would have been peace, a clean resolution, justice handed to a system and washed of my hands. And I had decided somewhere in that leather chair, conversation, that peace was no longer a language I was interested in speaking. Instead, I spent the next 3 weeks documenting everything myself, timestamps, part numbers, chop shop invoices Erman's contact had photographed, cross-referenced against our own shop's inventory logs, which I, conveniently, had administrative access to as head technician. I built a file thick enough to end a man's freedom, and then I did something Derek would never have predicted from the quiet mechanic he considered beneath him. I didn't use it against him yet. I used it as leverage against my own departure instead, walking into his office on a Friday afternoon and telling him calmly that I was quitting to open a shop of my own directly across the street, and that I expected him to make no trouble about it, because trouble, in this particular case, was a word that could mean several different things. Derek laughed in my face exactly the way I knew he would. He told me I could open whatever pathetic garage I wanted, that without his client relationships I'd be lucky to service used sedans, that the rich kids would stay loyal to him because loyalty, in his mind, was purchased with golf outings and expensive scotch. I said nothing to correct him. I simply walked out, and within a month, every single one of those trust fund clients whose midnight phone calls I'd answered for a full year followed me across the street without a second thought, because it turned out loyalty built on competence and genuine care outlasts loyalty built on charisma every single time. Derek's shop, stripped of the technician who'd been the actual engine behind its reputation, began hemorrhaging business within weeks. Word spreads fast in a world of six-figure cars and bored rich kids, and the word spreading now was that Apex Tuning's real talent had left, taking the magic with him. 6 months later, exactly as I'd expected, Derek called me himself, his voice stripped of its old smugness, offering me $500,000 a year to come back, telling me that ought to be enough to keep me happy. I let the silence stretch just long enough for him to feel it before I told him I appreciated the offer, but I'd made my position clear. I wasn't leaving my own shop to go back to working for a man who'd once handed me $10,000 for building him an empire. He pushed harder, mentioning our old friendship, mentioning history, mentioning years of loyalty I'd apparently owed him for the crime of being hired when no one else would take a chance on an ex-con. I told him, quite simply, that friendship had never once appeared in our contract, and if he wanted to talk about what was written down versus what was merely discussed, I was more than happy to have that conversation, because I had spent the last 6 months writing down quite a lot myself. That was the moment I let him hear, for the first time, exactly how much I knew. I described, in flat, unemotional detail, the chop shop 2 counties over, the inventory discrepancies I'd quietly copied before I ever handed in my resignation, the timestamps that would show a state auditor precisely how a shop claiming $8 million in legitimate profit had actually been laundering stolen parts through its own books for over a year. I told him I hadn't gone to the police yet, and I let the word "yet" sit in that silence exactly as long as it needed to. Derek's voice, when it finally came back, had lost every trace of the man who'd once mocked me for thinking I was worth $2.4 million. He asked me what I wanted. I told him I wanted exactly what our original agreement said I was owed, retroactively, in full, with interest, transferred within the week, or the file went to the state licensing board along with a very detailed anonymous tip about a chop shop 2 counties over. He tried, weakly, one last threat, reminding me I had a record, that no one would believe an ex-con over a licensed business owner. I told him that was precisely why I'd spent 6 months building a case out of numbers instead of accusations, because numbers don't care whether the man presenting them once went to prison, they only care whether they add up, and his didn't. Derek paid. Not because some deep well of decency finally opened in him, but because the alternative was a criminal investigation that would have ended not just his business but his freedom, and cowardice, in the end, is a far more reliable motivator than conscience. The wire transfer landed in my account 4 days later, $2.4 million plus enough in penalty interest, to make the number feel less like restitution and more like tribute. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I simply sat in the small office of my own shop that night, the one built from nothing but reputation and midnight phone calls, and I looked at the number in my account and understood that this was never really about the money at all. It was about the specific, surgical satisfaction of watching a man who believed my worth could be measured in $10,000 increments discover too late that he had spent a year underestimating the one person in his life who actually understood how engines, ledgers, and consequences all worked according to the same unforgiving mathematics. Derek's shop folded 18 months later, quietly, the way most collapses do once the golf buddies and trust fund clients smell blood in the water. Richard Herman, who had gotten exactly what he wanted out of our arrangement without ever having to pay me a single dollar of that 50% stake he dangled, tried once more to recruit me, and I turned him down again, because I had learned, finally, the actual lesson buried underneath everything Derek had ever said to me. I didn't need Derek's shop, and I didn't need Herman's empire either. I needed only the thing I'd built quietly across the street with my own 2 hands and my own unglamorous relationships. The thing that had grown in 18 months into the most sought-after tuning garage in the state, staffed by mechanics I paid exactly what our contracts promised, because I remembered precisely what it felt like to be told I wasn't worth what I was owed. There was no clean, peaceful reconciliation in this story, no forgiveness extended, No old friendship salvaged from the wreckage. Derek and I never spoke again after that final wire transfer cleared. I didn't want peace with him. I wanted precisely what I got, proof, delivered in cold hard numbers, that the man who once called me nothing more than someone covered in grease had, in the end, been made to pay full price for every single thing he tried to steal.